Hello, good morning students. Today we'll be discussing Emily Dickinson and the themes that she touches up in her poems. Earlier in our first lecture we talked about what sort of a poet is Emily Dickinson. In this part we'll see what are the themes, what are the subjects that she touches upon. So, the most prominent subject you will see when we go through Dickinson's poems is death. As we have read one of our poems, I felt a funeral in my brain. It is also about death, the feeling of death or near death. So, the first prominent theme that we see in Dickinson's poem is death. Death is one of the foremost themes in her poems, and no two poems we'll see that are same, exactly the same. They are different in the understanding of death. However, death is sometimes gentle, sometimes it is very cruel, menacing, and sometimes you can find it something that is inevitable. In the poem I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, Dickinson investigates the physical process of dying. In Because I Could Not Stop for Death, she personifies death and presents the process of dying as simply a realization that there is eternal life, that we have to move beyond this life to go to that world. In Behind Me Dips Eternity, death is a normal state. Life is just a interruption, means the permanent state is death. Life is just an interruption in between. In My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun, the existence of death allows for the existence of life. In Some Work for Immortality, death is the moment where the speaker can cash their check of good behavior for their eternal rewards. All these varied pictures, varied images of death, however, do not truly contradict each other. Death is the ultimate unknown fact, and so Dickinson circles around it again and again in her poems, painting portraits of each of its many facets that we see during our lives as a way to come as close to knowing it as she can. So, next is what is the idea of truth for Dickinson? Dickinson is fascinated and obsessed with the idea of truth and with finding it in her poems. She knows that this is close to impossible, like to fill a gap. And she teaches and answers one question again and again, which just leads to further questions. Yet she also posts that a kind of truth can be found if done so circuitously, as in tell all the truth but tell ill slant. This is reflected in how she deals with all of her poems, all the themes that are reflected in her poems. Her poems come back to these central themes again and again, but they are never treated in exactly the same way in the coming poems or the subsequent poems. She discovers new sides to each of them, comes at them from new angles, differently she tries to see them, and by investigating each theme again and again in different ways or contradictory ways, she is in a way finding the truth in her circuits, means around her. So, Dickinson also clearly shows that truth is found more easily in negative or painful emotions. In I Like a Look of Agony, she shows how she can only trust people who are dying, because she feels that a person who is dying will not fake or will not lie. Her own grief and others is powerful to her, because while it may not be pleasant, she has found something honest in it. and this drives her poetry. The experience of these painful emotions have always allowed her, or always make her to think, to represent them faithfully, and therefore write honest poetry. Next is fame and success. The theme of fame and success. So Dickinson has written many poems dealing with fame and success. These poems almost always explain or elucidate the negative sides of these ostensibly positive things in life. In I am nobody, who are you? To gain fame we must advertise oneself, use one's own name and identity as some marketing tools. This fame also is made meaningless by the fact that its audience is an unthinking person. Success is Countess Sweetest does not represent quite so wholly a negative vision of fame and success, though success here, however, is still a dangerous propagation, for it takes away the speaker's ability to appreciate one's success. This represents a general lessening of the successful person's emotional area, emotional realm, and if this success is in the field of poetry, that will certainly lead to weaker poems in the future. She feels that if one feels proud about one's achievements, his career graph or his graph would come down. This focus on the negatives of fame and success makes it seem like that Dickinson did not want them for herself, that she was happier with her unpublished poems and being unknown. However, by the simple fact that she wrote about them so frequently, she may have known very well the dangers of them. So it clearly is found in her poems that fame and success are though enticing and fascinating, but still they have their own negative sides to them. Then is the theme of grief. So grief is virtually present everywhere in Dickinson's poetry. Other characters are few and far between in these poems, but grief is practically Dickinson's primary companion. When other people do appear, it is often only in grief that allows Dickinson to feel connected to them, because she feels that a person who is in grief is in or her usual self, the honest self. So she feels that grief is the one thing that binds us. She trusts people who display a look of agony, and because it is the only emotion that she knows must be true, it is only when a dead person or a person who is dying that Dickinson's wall of distrust collapses. So she only believes or has faith in a person who is on his or her deathbed, because she feels that that person is really honest at that point of time. In I measure every grief I meet, grief does not just bring Dickinson closer to others because she can trust it, but rather because it is a bond between them, and knowing they are grieving too many to make her burden of grief somewhat lighter. Thus in I like a look of agony and I measure every grief I meet, it is only grief that allows Dickinson to feel that she is a part of the community. So Dickinson has shown another positive side of grief in her poems, and it gives her strength. In I Can Wait Grief, she makes it clear that happiness only intoxicates her, makes her stumble and lose her great perceptive abilities. Grief, however, emboldens her, makes her able to face anything, and gives her the strength and perceptiveness to write the poetry that she wants to write, because it brings out the real self of her in her poems. Then there is the theme of faith. In Dickinson's poetry, we find that she is highly interested in faith, God, religion. The fact that she has so often written about the traditional religious hymnal stanza form emphasizes this fact. God is essential to her, yet she is unwilling to just accept the traditional dogmas, and so she explores other possibilities for faith in her poetry. Just like while she follows stanza form, she breaks the conventions and of rhyme and punctuation. Often many of her poems about nature seem to be the most religious. There is a certain slant of light, presents this light as almost a divine one, a divine vision, and shows how nature can be very closely tied to God, yet it can also distance the reader from him. The bat is done with wrinkled wings shows that it is the ugly and eccentric creatures who can bring us closest to an understanding of God. Therefore, we can say that her poems never claim to any understanding of the divine. However, whatever she is most certain of is God's inscrutability, and it is only her relationship to him that she can fully investigate. In many of her poems, we can see that there is another figure besides the speaker, means some divine self or some divine attribute, some divine being is always there. It is often unclear whether this figure is God or a lover, and these poems can often be read either way. This explains the profound closeness with God that Dickinson has searched throughout her poems, throughout her writings. Then we can see that she expresses her freedom through poetry. Poetry in Dickinson's poem is an expansive and a liberating force. In They Shut Me Up in prose, society tries to limit the speaker to the acceptable female roles, shutting her in closets or in prose to prevent her from expressing herself. So these limitations are broken by Dickinson. How she and all these limitations inspire her more and more and fuel her to write her poetry. This cannot limit her, no matter how they try, for poetry is limitless, and she shows us in I Dwell in Possibility. It's a house with no roof but the sky, means it's limitless. She can go beyond the sky. This metaphor of poetry as house also allows Dickinson to transform what oppresses her and those female tasks of running the household into a setting for what frees her poetry. That means, in a way, she is expressing the gender roles, gender hierarchy, gender relationships and their place in society, and she is breaking the rules of society by talking about or transforming the female tasks that are allotted to women. This metaphor also allows Dickinson to take possession of poetry. It is not solely a male vocation, that women can also search or move around in this realm of politics, wars, and she is just not confined to the kitchen, house and the garden. Then the theme she touches, that you can find intensity of emotions in her poetry, and which exhibits a profoundness of intense emotions, and her poems also focus on this as a subject, extolling the virtues of such intensity. In I Like a Look of Agony, she shows that only the most intense emotions can be trusted, can be exhibited for others with honesty, and therefore only the more intense emotion belong in poetry. Dare You See a Soul at the White Heat shows, however, that while positive, This level of emotional intensity is neither easy to produce and experience, nor is it easy to observe. In this poem, the speaker tries to enact a painful forging process to refine her emotions to that heightened level, and while we can find that it is glorious, almost divine when she does so, it is still a challenging thing for the reader to observe. The first day's night had come shows just how dangerous such intense emotions can be sometimes, while the reader must dare to witness it. In this poem, the speaker's emotions are so overpowering that she cannot maintain a whole incorporated identity and she loses her mind. Therefore, we can say that while most of the Dickinson's poems bring out the honesty in these heightened emotions, we see that there is also a risk in searching through it or going through them. These are the main themes that you will find when we go through our poems, and when you try to relate these subjects with the poems that we will be reading, you will be able to understand Dickinson in a much better way, and you can correlate the ideas that she has given. Thank you.